My mom is a pretty chill person. She's a little religious nowadays, but a lot of that has to do with her past, which, mind you, is pretty crazy. She grew up in the 70s and lived a fairly normal life. Over the years, as I've gotten older, I've begun to know her more like a friend and less like a mom. Recently, she confided in me why she hates Halloween. Growing up, my mom let me and my brother celebrate the holiday, but she never got into the spirit of Halloween. No decorations, no parties. She just let us go trick-or-treating with our dad, and that was it. She never passed out candy. All of this had to do with something tragic from her past, something that happened on one Halloween night. You've probably heard about the candy scars from back in the day. The rumor was that someone put razor blades in candy and a couple kids got jacked up. Since then, they've debunked the stories, stating rather conclusively that they were urban legends with no factual truth. According to my mom, though, some of these stories were real. And because of that, she can't celebrate Halloween. My mom grew up in a suburb outside of Milwaukee. Like every other little kid in the world, she was excited to celebrate Halloween. She was 9 years old when it happened. Everything was normal, she said, like every other Halloween. Her father would take her and her sister and brother trick-or-treating right at 7. They would walk around collecting candy for an hour or so and then head back home. They got to eat a few pieces of candy and then watch a show together before heading to bed. On that particular Halloween, my mom said she was dressed as Minnie Mouse. Her younger brother was Mickey and her older sister was Daisy Duck. They were a trifecta of Disney characters. They walked around their neighborhood, just like in previous years, and started filling their buckets with candy from their neighbors. Then they got to one house on the end of their street, a house they normally avoided. My mom didn't really specify why they avoided it. They just did. They approached the house apprehensively, taking a few small steps at a time, trying to guard how close they got. The man that opened the door, according to my mom, was massive. He was bald and his stare was empty. He reached into their bags and placed candy, but they couldn't tell what he'd put inside, if anything. There was a group of kids walking with them who started eating candy right away. My mom looked over and saw a kid smile, and then his face turned stone cold. Blood poured out of his mouth. He started coughing and convulsing on the sidewalk. My mom, as a little kid, reached down to help him, but he just spit blood on her. As she was telling me about it, she said he just kept spitting blood more and more until her Minnie costume was covered in it. The kid tried to talk, but it was to no avail. He opened his mouth and his tongue fell out. Right there on the sidewalk, his tongue fell out of his mouth. Still to this day, Mom turns white as she tells the story, the blood leaving her face. There was so much blood, she said, and the way his tongue fell out of his mouth, it was like he was just spitting out broccoli he didn't want to eat. My mom said everyone around them started screaming. They were looking for an adult, someone to intervene in the situation. But it was just the few of them standing there. Then another kid started coughing a little further down the street. It was the same thing as before. Blood filled the front of his shirt until he passed out on the ground. My mom was about to run towards him when another kid right next to her started going through the same thing. Blood leaked out of his mouth and ran down his street. The way my mom tells it, he looked at her in the eyes, crying and begging for her to do something. Then his mouth burst open as blood spilled out. He spit out stuff from the inside, not his tongue, but his tonsils. They plopped on the ground and then he passed out. I find this all hard to believe, but according to my mom, what happened next was the most terrifying thing to ever occur. 4 or 5 more kids started going through the same thing. Blood spewed all around her. She looked to my uncle. His smile cracked open and blood came trickling out, filling his Mickey Mouse costume. She screamed and wrapped her arms around him. The blood soaked her shirt as well. He opened his mouth and then his head snapped backwards. The full weight of his body was too much for my mom, so she let him drop to the ground. At that moment, she says, she looked back at the creepy house and the man was standing there on his porch. He was staring out at the carnage. He was smoking a long pipe and laughing maniacally. "The end is coming, children," he said. "The end is coming." Although my mom thought the scene was undetected by police or adults, she was wrong. Shots rang out in the night, and the man on the porch fell to his knees. In seconds, he was surrounded by police who cuffed him and kicked down his door. My mom stood there on the sidewalk watching it all happen. They recovered a lot of interesting items from his house. They found a basement with various torture devices. They found hundreds of Polaroid pictures all over his house of kids and teenagers. And they found a bowl full of chopped up razor blades. Turns out the man in the house was chopping up razor blades and putting them into candy. Some of the pieces were large, others were fairly small. The end result, however, was the same. They cut up the inside of his victims' mouths. My mom said she threw away all the candy she collected that night. Her brother, my uncle, survived the massacre. To this day, he has a bit of a speech impediment when he talks. He says it's just how his tongue works. My mom tells me he has blocked out the memory of that Halloween night, and rightfully so. After all my mom went through on that Halloween night, I'm surprised she let any of us participate in the holiday. I asked her why she is okay with us going out and experimenting with the candy. As a young kid, I remember my mom meticulously checking the candy before we got to dig in. She'd open most of the pieces just to be safe and find that they were without razor blades or tampering of any kind. I appreciated it and all. She confided in me. I don't sleep at all on Halloween. I'm up half the night thinking about that man on his front porch and the kids who spit out their tongues. I don't think I'll ever unsee that. We survived Halloween this year as we normally do. But when my mom told me that story, I couldn't help but think a little differently about the holiday. I understand why she stays inside and doesn't dress up. I understand now why she hates Halloween.